Okay, let's unpack this. You sent us a question sparked by our recent chats about how good reading is for your brain. It's a big one, and honestly, a bit of a lightning rod question for some people. Do audiobooks really count as reading? Are you actually getting the same mental benefits, the same workout for your brain as you would with a physical book?
That's exactly what we're diving into today.
Yeah.
Based on the sources you provided, we're going to explore the science behind how our brains handle information. Well, in different formats. We'll look at the reported benefits and, yes, absolutely tackle that persistent debate head on. Our mission really is to pull out the key insights from these findings so you can understand what's happening upstairs, when you choose to listen, and maybe even what the idea of reading itself means in today's world.
Right. So let's start with the brain itself. When you encounter a story, whether it's on a page or coming through your headphones, the sources point to two major cognitive processes at play.
Right. Their first one is language processing. This is the core task of understanding the meaning, the words, the sentences, the whole narrative structure. And what the sources suggest is that this process happens remarkably similarly, whether those words are coming into your brain via your eyes reading text or via your ears listening to audio. The brain's doing the same fundamental work of just making sense of the language.
Okay, so understanding the meaning, that's pretty much the same. What's the second process then, the one where things might differ?
That's decoding. And this is where physical reading really differs. It's your brain's job to translate those visual symbols, the letters, the words printed on the page, into meaning. It's quite a complex visual task, actually. When you're listening to an audiobook, well, your brain isn't doing that specific visual decoding work, not in the same way. It's getting pre-decoded info.
That seems like a pretty fundamental difference, though. Doesn't that impact things?
It does, yeah, especially initially. But one study cited brings up a really fascinating point. For most people, by the time they hit adolescence, decoding becomes incredibly efficient. It's almost automatic. The source calls it second nature.
Second nature, right.
So while that specific visual decoding isn't happening with audio, for an adult who's been reading for years, the impact of skipping that step might be, less significant than it would be for, say, a very young child still learning phonics.
Okay, that distinction makes sense. The basic language understanding is similar. And for experienced readers, that decoding part becomes less of a conscious effort anyway. So how does this play out when we look at comprehension? Because that's usually the big sticking point, isn't it, in the audio versus physical reading debate?
Absolutely. And this is where the sources present a pretty consistent picture overall. The general finding across many studies, listening comprehension and reading comprehension are very, very similar. Often the difference is described as negligible.
Negligible is a strong word.
Sure.
So the overwhelming finding is they're pretty much on par.
For the average adult, yes, seems so. But this is where we have to, dig into the nuance the sources provide. While the general trend is similarity, they also highlight studies that seem to conflict, and it's the variables that seem to explain it.
Okay, tell us about those. Where do we actually see differences?
Well, the source details one study comparing participants listening to a nonfiction text versus reading it on an e-reader. Comprehension was, and I quote, nearly exactly the same. The listeners scored only slightly lower, but it was a very, very small difference.
Right. Practically no difference then.
Exactly. Supports that negligible point. But then there was another study mentioned, one with a dramatically different result.
Yeah, I remember reading about that one. What happened there?
Okay, so contrast that first one with a study involving university students. They were absorbing lecture material. One group listened to it like a podcast. The other read the transcript. The difference there was significant, a massive gap, actually, something like 28% lower comprehension for the listening group.
Wow, 28%. That is huge. So how do we reconcile that with the other findings? What's going on?
This is where the source really emphasizes the human variable. It's key. In that university study, the students were likely highly practiced at reading academic stuff, right? But maybe not so much at listening to complex lectures and retaining it all.
Okay, so it's about what you're used to.
Exactly. The sources point out that auditory processing isn't fixed. It's a skill you can develop. If you're not used to taking in complex information through audio, yeah, your initial comprehension might be lower. But just like physical reading, studies show this skill can improve a lot, actually, with practice. It can rise and rise and rise as you listen more.
Okay. So it's not just about the format itself, but your experience and skill level with that specific format. That makes a lot of sense.
Precisely. Yeah. So while, yes, some studies show a difference, especially depending on the material or maybe the listener's habits, the bulk of the research suggests that for the average person, listening and reading are, pretty much on an even playing field for comprehension. Any difference is usually mildly smaller for audio, but often described as very, very small, and it seems heavily influenced by how much practice you have listening attentively to complex stuff. Okay, got it. Comprehension, largely similar for most. Practice matters, individual variation. Cool. What about the deeper cognitive benefits we've talked about before? Things like building memory or, increasing empathy. This is another area where the sources provide a really clear answer. When it comes to the neurological benefits of engaging with narrative, those positive changes happening in your brain, they are consistently almost all the same. That holds true whether you're physically reading or listening to an audiobook. Wow, okay, that's a really significant point. So even though the decoding part is different, the outcome for the brain, it's effectively the same for those deeper benefits. That seems to be the finding, yeah. The specific benefits mentioned, like increased memory capacity, boosted empathy from engaging with characters, even increased attention span through sustained focus, they're reported to be nearly identical across both formats. The sources even cite studies indicating that the brain uses the same part of our brain to process the language in the story, whether it's coming from a page or through your headphones. So, yeah, for those widely discussed neurological benefits, you're absolutely set with either format. Looks like it.
That really does cut through some of the noise, doesn't it?
Right.
Which brings us neatly to the noise itself, what the source writer frankly calls snobbery. This persistent idea that listening to an audiobook is somehow cheating. The source writer says they still to this day don't understand this perspective.
Oh, it's such a common sentiment, isn't it? But yeah, the sources push back against it strongly. There's a great analogy used. Imagine two people need to get to the same place. One bike's there, putting in all that physical effort. The other drives a car. When they both arrive, the biker accuses the driver of cheating because they didn't, pedal and sweat. The source writer just calls this nonsense. Both people reach the destination, right? The method of travel doesn't invalidate the fact that they got there.
Right. You reach the story. The destination is the narrative experience itself, not how you travel.
Exactly. And the source uses a really lovely personal anecdote to illustrate this. Talks about their own dad. Apparently he read physically as a kid, but now he exclusively listens to audiobooks. Yet the source writer notes he probably reads more books than they do, even though they're a physical reader.
That's brilliant.
Yeah. They share access to audiobook apps. They're always recommending titles back and forth. And they have these deep, meaningful discussions about the books they've both consumed.
I love that image. It really highlights that the connection, the important part, is over the story, the characters, the ideas, not the format you use to get it.
Precisely. The core argument here is that when you listen to a book, you are still consuming the same story. Full stop. You're experiencing the same characters, the same plot, the same pacing, the same everything just about as someone reading the text. The richness of that narrative experience, the ability to discuss the book is just as valid.
It makes you wonder, like the source writer does, what the goal even is here with the cheating thing.
Yeah.
What competition have they entered? Where's the competition? What's the prize? Like, really?
It really does seem to be, as the source suggests, a kind of elitism that happens within basically any hobby or community, doesn't it? People sometimes feel the need to police how others engage, believing their way is the only true or superior one.
Yeah, gatekeeping.
Totally.
Yeah.
And the source writer's plea is simple. Let's try not to do that, especially when the goal should be to encourage more people to engage with stories, right? Regardless of format. The reading community should be, united, not fractured over how people choose to read.
Well said. Totally agree. So, okay, the science says benefits are largely similar. The cheating idea seems like, nonsense. But are there any unique benefits? Things that audiobooks might offer more of, or maybe uniquely?
Yes, the sources do point to a few potential advantages that might be specific to engaging with audio.
Like what? Anything beyond just, convenience or multitasking?
Well, one is potentially learning how to pronounce things at a faster rate just by hearing them read aloud correctly by a narrator. Makes sense. Another one mentioned is studies indicating improved time management, though the source is a bit cautious here, noting this might be less about audiobooks inherently and more about the fact that listening often happens while multitasking.
Right, you can fit it in while commuting or cooking or whatever.
Yeah, exactly. You're layering it into other activities. And maybe a really important one, audiobooks can help build critical listening skills.
Ooh, interesting. Tell me more about that.
Well, the source highlights that, let's be honest, many of us fail at sustained, attentive listening. Our minds wander, even in conversations.
Guilty as charged.
Right, me too. Listening to audiobooks, especially complex narratives, requires focused auditory attention. And doing that regularly, the sources say, do improve our listening comprehension skill, which is just a really valuable skill in life generally, far beyond just books.
That critical listening skill.
Yeah.
Yeah, that sounds incredibly valuable and definitely something many of us could work on. But okay, while these studies give us these big picture averages, the source really hammers home that the average isn't the whole story, right? It keeps coming back to individual experience.
Absolutely. over and over. The sources repeatedly emphasize that people are individuals and people process things in different ways. Those human variables we talked about, they aren't just footnotes. They likely explain a lot of the inconsistencies you see across different studies. What works best is truly subjective. It can vary massively from person to person.
And the source writer shares their own personal pros and cons with audiobooks, which are really insightful and relatable, actually.
They do, yeah. A big pro for them is that multitasking aspect, being able to switch between a physical book and an audiobook of the same story, just to live in that story throughout the day, dipping in while, say, cooking dinner.
Which is fascinating because didn't the source mention finding an online forum comment that directly contradicted that exact experience?
Yeah, it's perfect. Someone apparently commented basically saying, there's no way that someone can listen to an audiobook and cook dinner. Cooking dinner takes too much focus. You will not retain it. It's impossible and you can't convince me otherwise. Wow. Just wow. That perfectly illustrates what the source calls the folly of seeing the world only through the tiny little lens of your own experience, doesn't it?
It really does. Assuming your personal limits or abilities are the universal truth for everyone else, it's just not accurate. As the source notes, the brain is more nuanced than that. It does function differently from person to person. I mean, we already know about concepts like auditory versus visual learners, right? People's attentional capacities while multitasking also vary wildly. Totally. And for the source writer personally, maybe the most powerful pro they mention relates to their experience with dyslexia.
Oh, this point is incredibly important, yeah. They describe having bad dyslexia days where reading physical text is genuinely difficult, words seeming to move around, feeling illiterate despite being highly literate.
That sounds incredibly frustrating.
Totally.
Yeah.
And on those days, audiobooks just remove that physical barrier to accessing the stories they love. That accessibility, allowing them to keep engaging with books when physical reading is impossible, is described as, quote, a really big deal.
That's such a crucial benefit. Accessibility, inclusivity. That's huge in the world of reading.
Absolutely. Now, on the con side, for the source writer personally, they still subjectively prefer physical books overall. They find annotating is a lot harder with audio, which makes sense. And for them personally, they feel like their long-term retention is not nearly as good with audio. Specific details sometimes fade faster, they think. Though they are quick to add that their memory isn't, stellar generally across the board anyway.
Right. So even someone who finds audiobooks invaluable for specific reasons, like multitasking and crucial accessibility, they still acknowledge personal preferences and maybe perceive differences in how they process information depending on the format.
Exactly. And it brings us right back to that core message from the source. Individual experiences matter. Immensely. Ultimately, people are individuals. Let people like what they like and experience what they experience. End of story. Really.
So, okay, to bring it all together then, what's the distilled summary, the bottom line from the sources you shared?
Well, it seems to be this. As a general rule, for the average individual, the neurological benefits you get from engaging with a story, the memory building, the empathy, the attention span, they're very, very similar whether you read or listen. Comprehension is also largely similar. Some studies show a slight, often very, very small edge for physical reading, but that seems heavily influenced by your practice with the format. Overall, for the average person, you're pretty much on a level playing field regarding these core benefits.
Okay. And the crucial takeaway about the individual experience.
That's where subjectivity just reigns supreme. As far as the individual pros and cons go, the personal feelings, the experiences, well, that's entirely personal. That's subjective. The science suggests that if you love audiobooks and feel like you're engaging deeply with the story, you absolutely are.
You're a valid reader.
Exactly. You're a valid reader. If you prefer physical books, cool. That's fine too. The most important thing seems to be engaging with stories in a way that genuinely works for your brain.
This deep dive has really shown us, I think, that the science largely backs up audiobooks as a really powerful way to engage with stories, offers very similar cognitive benefits, while also highlighting that, individual experience, practice, and especially accessibility are such key parts of the whole picture.
Absolutely. And perhaps that leaves you, the listener, with this final thought to mull over, something drawn from the heart. If the core value of reading is truly about experiencing and processing a story, the characters, the plot, the ideas, and audiobook demonstrably allow you to do exactly that, often providing very similar brain benefits. Does acknowledging the reality of individual different things like comprehension and the power of practice mean that maybe we need to broaden our definition of what it means to read or even to be well read in a world filled with diverse media? It's just something to think about. Consider your own brain, your own experiences, and what method truly works best for you to connect with the stories